over the years, it's been interesting how often, like, I end up having to live through my own sermon and always grow from it. So today I have to say, like, whoops, I brought a previous iteration of my sermon onto mine. I open it up, I'm like, that won't work. So I have to humble myself and say, I need the file, Mike. So interesting how that works out. So there are hot topics for speakers, whether it's the business world or whether it's the preaching world, right? If you have a conversation about success, you're going to get a packed room. You want to talk about achieving your dreams or your goals or reaching your destiny. You're going to unlock your potential, and you'll pack them in. Talk about humility? Not quite as scintillating, is it? You probably didn't wake up this morning thinking, I need to be more humble. But surprise me. Anyone have that waking thought? Yeah, didn't think. Nor maybe even in the last week did you think, what I'm really missing is a higher level of humility in my life. It's just not one of those things that we aspire to. But as we shall discover, or perhaps for you rediscover this morning, is that if we want to live the life that pleases God, as revealed to us through Jesus, that at some point, one point or another, we need to have a discussion about humility. So over the next 4 weeks, I'm going to talk about integrity, and integrity specifically from God's perspective, and of course, it's a much broader discussion than any 4 weeks. But so this morning, I'm going to talk about humility, and my next time with you will be generosity, and then wholeness, and then we'll wrap it up with wisdom. So I'm hoping that you want to become a better person. Anyone here want to become a better person? Finally, I knew you could move your hands. Excellent. So when we think about that, I suspect we often will kind of move into the direction of, I shouldn't watch as much TV as I do. Or, you know what, I should probably spend more time watching this kind of a show versus that kind of a show. Or I don't move enough, I don't exercise enough. I don't know, maybe I should watch my alcohol consumption. Or, I just find myself talking too much about other people. And as the old Southern song says, it's all true, so it's not gossip. Or, you think, I'm just not a very thoughtful person. And so may I suggest, as we give consideration to becoming a better person, it will also involve some areas that we don't think about very often. And yet those areas that we don't think about very often can often be very critical to our growth. So I've heard, as I suspect many of you have, a lot of conversation these days about courage. More specifically, the lack therein. And it's generally a conversation about how they need more courage. They ought to stand up and do what's right. Why are they letting them do that? But what's often missing is putting up that reflective mirror in front of ourselves and saying, well, what about me? Asking ourselves, what does our acting courageously look like? And that's a fair question, right? So today I want us to think about marrying courage and integrity around humility. Because I believe that it takes courage to live the life that you were created to live, especially now. Because I think right now it's easy to be a Monday morning Christian, kind of a backseat Christian, and yell at our TVs or yell at our speakers or yell at our partners. How can they let them get away with that? How can you, as you're watching the TV, you've got a you in front of you, how can you let them get away with that? Why is no one stopping them? And that's what we often do, isn't it? And so how do we crank up our own courage? So for me, one of the ways that I think about it is that courage actually comes from something even deeper within us, and that's that life of integrity. So integrity, I'm suggesting, is our launching pad. And I think we all know integrity is both seen and unseen, right? There's our life that others observe, and then there's the inner us. Don't you think it's possible to have a smile on our lips and hate in our heart? So integrity is the marriage, the honest marriage of the inner and the outer me. So what's it mean to live an integrated life? Well, two things come to mind. First is that inner outer, right? If I'm going to have a life of integrity, I want my inner life to be the same as my outer life. And that in and of itself, can we admit that's a bar, right? That's as we move on in our life towards that upward prize of Christ Jesus, as the author of Hebrews puts it in Hebrews 11. That's the goal, isn't it? I mean, we're going to keep working on that because there's still some inner parts of us that oh boy, could God get in there and do some shaping in my life? And then the second thing that comes to mind is we are living an integrated life when the decisions we make and the actions we take are based upon our character and not based upon our circumstances. So it's based upon, so we're living an integrated life when we have a life that's based upon our character and not our circumstances. It kind of goes back to what we talked about last week, that joy, no one can take my joy, but my happiness, yeah, I can be unhappy about some things. So we're going to talk about our character. So this morning I want to lift up one of the key components of that foundation and often overlooked and under discussed, and that is humility. Yeah. So kind of what Lisa was getting at. Anyone here think you have enough humility in your life? That's one of those catch me questions, isn't it? But again, humility is not one of the world's most enviable attributes. So when you were a kid, did anyone here play pickup games? Yeah. Don't you feel kind of sad that that's almost unheard of these days? I mean, it's so crazy to think that that's in the rearview mirror. I wonder if kids even know that phrase, what a pickup game is. So at school, we had dodgeball in the Washington Elementary cafeteria. I think I'm still traumatized by it. I saw no reason to get in front of something thrown fast. I just never made sense to me, but that's what the teacher said we had to do. But in our neighborhood, we played pickup basketball and football. And you know how it goes. You get two captains, usually they're the best athletes, most popular, or the biggest, and then you stood in line and everyone, they picked you or they didn't. I'll take Steve, I'll take Larry, I'll take Gary, I'll take Kim, I'll take Jackie. Well, I grew up out of that misery, in the middle of that misery, and I can tell you it's pretty much my entire childhood, I was picked last, yes. Now, I wish that was hyperbole or metaphor, but I'm talking literal history. I was almost always picked last, and since this is a conversation about humility, I'll go ahead and say I probably was the least talented person, but in my defense, I was also the youngest kid in the neighborhood. So I don't know if that's defense or an excuse. I'm not sure which that is. I wasn't always the least talented, though. Excuse me. Because, see, there was another variable. And that variable was that my brother was one of the captains, along with our near neighbor, Gary Smith. This is 65 years ago. I'm so scarred, I still remember his name. So Ryan and Gary would always pick the teams. And so whether they're playing football or baseball or whatever it was, of course, they'd decide who went first. And I knew I was going to be picked last because, you see, my brother would never pick me, all right? And so Gary knew that my brother would never pick me, and so there was no point in wasting a turn by picking me because I would always be the guy there at the end, always there at the last. Well, sometimes as the numbers would work out, my brother would have the last pick. I was the only one left, and he would literally say, "You can have him." Yeah. So I was the guy who was picked after the last pick, you know. So I hated it, right? I hated the process. I hated the experience. I hated how it made me feel being last. So one day I woke up. Don't sure what day of the week it was. It might have been Saturday. I put my stake in the ground. I said, "Gary, I'm going to be the other captain." He said, "Fine." And so there I was. Gary picked my brother first, right? Okay. So they killed us, right? And I realized that the likelihood of me and my team ever beating Gary's team were somewhere between none and none. Okay. So then I stuck with this. So I began picking the worst athletes, those that were picked right before me. I decided since I was going to lose anyway, why not choose the guy who, like me, had always been picked close to the last? So I started picking the teams because I was like, I'm going to keep being the captain. And they were good with that. Why were they good with that? Because they were going to win. Right. But you know what? It made those others like myself, who had always been picked towards the end, made them feel good. And I also suspect, although they never admitted it, it wasn't much fun to beat us. It was like, college, like the pros beating, like the Major League Baseball team beating beating a bunch of high school kids. It really wasn't. There wasn't much joy in that for them. So at one point or another in my life, I realized that I actually stumbled upon a Jesus principle in the midst of this, that there's something inside of all of us that we don't like being picked last, and that we long to be picked first. And yet that seems to go against what we understand about humility, right, and humbleness. After all, it's the confident people who succeed. It's the confidence. Confidence is just a degree off of cockiness, and that's just a degree off of arrogance. And it's easy to confuse being conceited with being confident. And it seems like the cocky somehow always win, or at least they win all too often. And so why should we value humility? Well, do you want to be a person that God chooses? Do you want to be on Team God? Have you ever wanted to be the person that God trusts to get something done? Or how about the person God trusts with a responsibility, or maybe even a big responsibility, one that will make a difference in the world, maybe just your world? So what I want to talk about this morning is, how do we become the kind of person God chooses? Because if humility has any value, has any virtue, it is that the defining characteristic God looks for when God chooses a person to advance God's causes. God looks for a humble heart. We see this in what Rob read for us this morning, and to me it's a verse that cannot be read and reread too many times. Philippians chapter 2, this is Paul writing to the people at Philippi, and he writes this: "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ," just all these words, they just drip with goodness. "If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in the Spirit, and of one mind, doing nothing out of selfishness or ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility. value others above yourself. So if you've ever wondered what humility looks like, Paul gives us a window here, right? Humility values others above oneself. Humility not only looks to our own interests, but to the interest of others. Humility is at its zenith, has the same mindset as Jesus. Whoa, just think about that. Who, being the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his advantage. Now, what Paul's referencing there is in the Garden of Eden when it says Jesus could have called upon the angels and just like taken everybody out. So he said he did not use his relationship with God as something for his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. He emptied himself. This is sometimes called the great kenosis passage. He emptied himself, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in the appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient, even obedient to the point of death, even death upon a cross. So what we find or what we see in Jesus is that humility is ultimately expressed by choosing a posture of a servant. And a servant's highest expression is humility. And humility's highest expression is when we lay down our lives for the good of others. So Jesus totally turned the tables upside down in terms of the way people looked at leaders, right? Because Jesus took upon himself the highest virtue. And he not only reframed for us what it means to be truly human, but he changed for us what leadership looks like, right? The whole concept of leadership. Jesus changed, right? He integrated leadership and servanthood in a way that had never been thought of or never been expressed before. But more importantly, and often overlooked, is how Jesus revealed to us the nature of God, right? I've heard the talk, I don't know if you have too, this is a little bit deep theological, deep into weed stuff, but there's sometimes they go, well, why were we created, right? And there are those that say, well, does God have a need? Well, no, how can God have a need? You know, and so then there are others that say, well, God has one need, and that need was that God needed someone to worship God's self, okay? That's kind of the theological unraveling of that. And it's pretty prominent, pretty prevalent. I mean, you've probably never asked yourself, you know, you might ask yourself, why am I here? But maybe you've never thought to ask yourself, why is the whole kit and caboodle thing here? And so if you follow that, if you tease that out, right, that God had only one need, and that need was to be worshiped, then the next conversation can be, so we worship an almighty narcissist? The reason God created us was so that God would have someone to worship God's self? So everything God does is really all about God? What God really wants for you to acknowledge is how awesome God is. And so worship exists because God needs to be adored, and we're trapped in this universe that's been created by a narcissistic, emotionally needy creator. Worship me, adore me, glorify me. That's why I created you. And if that's the driving narrative of all creation, I'm not sure I would give God a passing grade, right? God's not doing too good in that department, right? But if the driving central narrative of God is love, then everything begins to make sense. You see, Jesus reveals to us what we are to be as humans. We are to embrace humility. Jesus reveals to us something about God that's so profound, so provocative, it changed the view of God forever. From Greek mythology to Roman mythology to the God of the Egyptians, those gods were an expression of those people's longings and their appetites for power and wisdom and to be all-knowing. And all of those attributes make sense to us about who God is, but what Jesus was revealing to us is that God is simply more than all-powerful, more than all-knowing. But God is the purest expression of humility. And God's not only more powerful than we are and wiser than we are, but get this, according to the scriptures, more humble than we are. Becoming a servant wasn't new to God. Jesus became a servant because that was natural. That's just who God was and God is. It was natural to serve. Jesus chose the path of humility because that's the only path that God has ever known. And so when they spoke about the gods of fire, the gods of winds and waters and Hades and the heavens, from Odin to Zeus to Neptune to Hermes, they spoke of all these gods with all of these attributes that made them divine. But our God is a God of humility. And our God's path is a path of servanthood. And so if we want to become more like God, and that's kind of almost like trick questions, but we are want to become more like God. You know, that's a whole other conversation, I guess. But Paul said, follow me as I follow God, right? Follow me as I follow Jesus. I mean, that's our aspiration, to, in our hearts, become the character of God. So if we want to become more like God, we betray ourselves when we want God's power and God's wisdom and God's insight, but do not want God's character, and that character seen most clearly in and through Jesus. And what do we read of Jesus? This is more or less right out of the gospel from John. Jesus made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death upon a cross. So what other path could God take? What other path could Jesus take? Except the path that serves and lives out of humility. You know, it might seem strange or maybe even demeaning to say God is a servant. It seems right to say God's powerful or God's all-wise or all-knowing or all these attributes about God that we say are true to his nature. But yet when we say God's a servant, might go, And yet maybe that's why we recoil a little bit at servanthood, right? Because if it's beneath God, maybe we feel it's a little bit beneath us as well. So if that's the case, it makes total sense for us to question, to go back, who does God choose? Paul, writing to the people at Rome, said, he who did not spare his own son, but gave himself for us. Who does God choose? Those who are willing to serve, those who are willing to give. He gave Jesus to us as an example of how we are to live. Those who are willing to serve and give of themselves to others with a humble spirit. In the call to give ourselves to others, we understand that God isn't asking us to do something that God did not do, but something God did in an ultimate way in giving us Jesus. See, when God thinks of greatness, servanthood is the final destination. And when you choose to be last, you're actually first. The seat of honor, the seat that chooses humility and servanthood and sacrifice, that's the seat of most honor. Jesus knew, again, this is right out of the Gospel of John, Jesus knew, it said that all things were in his authority. Do you remember this part of the story? And that he had come from God and that he was going to God. He knew all the power had been entrusted to him, and so he got up from the meal. This is our Maundy Thursday story, right? Took off his outer garment and wrapped a towel around his waist, and then he poured water into the basin, began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with his towel, and he comes to Simon, comes to Peter. Peter says, Lord, you gonna wash my feet? Jesus said, yeah, you don't realize now what I'm doing, but you shall understand later. Peter said, no, right? No, see, his concept was not of that of a servant God. Jesus said, no, don't cut it. He said, Peter, unless you let me wash your feet, you can't have any part of me. So can you hear what Peter is saying to Jesus? Jesus, you're never going to wash my feet. You won't serve me. You'll never be less than me, lower than me. Jesus, I can't allow you to humiliate yourself in this way. And Jesus says, hey, listen, unless I wash you, unless I serve you, unless I choose the path of humility and servanthood and sacrifice, you're not going to be on Team Jesus. Because that's my team. My team is going to be a group that serve with a humble heart. So Peter says, okay, Lord, well, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. You see, I think sometimes we think that the highest aspiration for many is to learn how to worship God. And that's a wonderful thing to do. Right, but the scriptures tell us something different. The scriptures tell us that humility is right there, humbleness. And that humility also is a choice. It's not some kind of dust, angel dust that's sprinkled on you that makes you humble. You have to choose that. And when Jesus came and walked among us, he washed the disciples' feet. He took the beatings and allowed himself to be crucified. Those weren't new choices for God. God had always chosen to be a servant. For humility, again, God's highest virtue. So if you want to trust God, if you want God to trust you with a slice of God's mission and the purpose in the world, and you want to choose to be like God, then you got to choose to serve in humility.